Hello, we're looking today at F5, Performance Management. Now, what is included in this paper? This paper, for some of you, will be a development on what you already know. A lot of you will have studied F2, F2 being the lower level management accounting paper. F5 simply develops on that. So when we look at the sort of things that may be included in F5, well, there are 5 key topic areas. Firstly, we have to look at costing methods. Now, that's not going to be too much of a problem to you guys, because you know them already. You know things like absorption costing and marginal costing. Now, of course, we're not going to bore you to death by looking at absorption and marginal costing again. What we're trying to do here is to develop upon them. So, we know about absorption and marginal costing, but how do we change things to reflect the fact that things have changed? Secondly, possibly the biggest single topic in this whole syllabus is decision-making. Again, it's very likely that you've looked at elements of decision-making already, such things as CVP analysis and relevant costs. All we're going to do is to develop on that. We're going to try and take our decision-making that much further. So we may take the relevant cost idea, and don't worry, we're going to start from the very beginning. We may take the relevant cost idea somewhat further. We may introduce uncertainty. We may look at pricing. But in essence, all we're doing is the same basic decision-making that a lot of you have already seen. Thirdly, possibly the smallest topic area of the 5, budgeting. Budgeting and budgetary control. Strangely, we don't do much in computations here. And the reason for that is that you've, theoretically at least, seen it in the past. So when we look at the budgeting question, it is quite likely that it is mostly going to be discursive, an essay question. There is one exception to that. One area of budgeting is that we have to look at forecasting. And when we focus on forecasting, it's numbers, numbers, numbers. Fourthly, we have something called variances. I suppose I really should say standard costing and variance analysis. But anybody who is to have any background in this area, and you should have by this stage, will know that it is whether you can calculate the variances or not. If you can calculate the variances, you'll score the marks, you'll be happy. If you can't, it's a non-starter. Finally, we have, well, I'm going to give it a general term performance appraisal. You see, I want to be slightly careful here. The whole topic of the exam is performance management. And this area effectively includes performance management amongst many other things. I would say to you that most of the time this area presents us with a lovely question in the exam. Having said that, there are some interesting topics in there, such as transfer pricing and divisional performance appraisal, that introduces, I don't know, a little bit of entertainment, shall we say. So, when we look at the paper, we have 5 core topic areas. So you could argue it's a small syllabus and therefore easy. But if we look at the history of this paper, I know it's only been around for a couple of sittings, we will identify that F5 has been a real challenge to all students. So, why is that? 5 topics should be nice and straightforward. Well, the first thing we have to note is what we already know with regard to most of the syllabuses at the F papers. If you remember, we've got, of course, 100% to earn, and we have 4 questions. 4 questions of 25 marks. Now, The first thing that springs to mind to me is that it's a compulsory exam. There is no choice. A lot of you will complain about that. You'll say, it's not fair. I want choice. But what I want to get across to you is that it is a level playing field for everybody. And what we have to do is simply respond to the format of the exam in the best manner to ensure that we are successful. We've got 4 questions. We've got 5 main topic areas. So what we can reasonably expect is each of those topic areas coming up most times. Because if you think about it, of these 4 questions, each question could have 2 or more topics in them. So we would expect over the whole exam for 6 or 7 topics to be heavily examined. That means each part of the syllabus will be addressed. And therefore, the most important thing for you to remember is that there cannot be any question spotting. If you decide that you're going to learn this and that, but not the other, what's going to happen? Well, you may be lucky, but the chances are you will not be. And the simple fact that something comes up that you haven't prepared to learn throws you out of your stride in the exam hall. And as a result of that, you are far less likely to be successful. So my very simple tip before we go anywhere with F5 is remember, we need to know a little bit about everything. We don't need to be absolute experts, but if we can do the basics well, we will be fine. The next thing that we have to identify is this idea. The split between narrative and computation. If I were to ask you what split you would expect in a paper like this, I think most of you would suggest that there was more computation and less narrative or essay writing. But I would suggest that absolute max computation will be 50% of the marks, and probably less. And the narrative will be at least 50% of the marks. The reason why this is so important is that when it comes to the computation, you guys are all equally good. So I'm expecting, well, a well-prepared student to get 30 out of 50 on the computations. If you're really good, 35. But remember, there will be some tricky stuff there. And because there's tricky stuff, don't expect to get it all right. In fact, if it's super tricky, you really don't want to try that bit. You want to move on and score the easier marks elsewhere. That means that if you are going to get to the Holy Grail, the 50% mark, how many marks do you need in the essay? Well, realistically, if we're looking at the essay or narrative parts, you need a further 30%. It is just as important. Now, a lot of people do not appreciate this. But if you attempt to get through this paper on the computation side alone, you will be sorely disappointed in the exam. And so what we're going to look at as we go through our studies, and in particular when we start looking at exam questions, is how do you get the essay marks?